Well, hello and welcome to Solar Alberta's 2024 Solar Series. Today's session is called Canada's Path to Net Zero. We were delighted to have so many people register for this event. Please note that we will be recording this webinar for future distribution. My name is Heather McKenzie and I'm the Executive Director at Solar Alberta. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge that I'm hosting you today and working day to day from Amiskwaciwaskahagan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place and home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papaches, Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux, nations whose ancestors have cared for and nurtured these lands since time immemorial. Today, we'll be hearing from Farah Sheriff of Natural Resources Canada. Following the discussion, there will be a question and answer period in which you can all participate. Farah's colleague, Jennifer Hiscock, will join us on the virtual stage for the Q&A as well. The entire session will wrap up in an hour and a half. In an effort to increase accessibility, we have enabled closed captioning for this presentation. You can turn the captioning on in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During our Q&A period, we will be using Zoom Q&A for questions rather than the chat box, so please enter your questions in the Q&A section. Also, please click on the little thumbs up symbol to upvote questions that you like. Before we move forward, we're going to do a quick poll to get a sense of who we have joining us today. Please take a minute to answer the questions popping up on your screen now. And while some are still doing the poll, I encourage you to also take a minute and pop your name, land acknowledgement, any contact info that you're comfortable sharing in the chat now and throughout the event so that others can look you up on LinkedIn or email you, and hopefully great new relationships can be formed. All right, wonderful. Thanks very much for participating in that. I see we have lots of solar curious folks here with us today, over half of you, but a good chunk of industry professionals as well, and of course some students. So welcome everybody. Glad to have you all with us today. Now, just a little about Solar Alberta before we jump into the presentation. This is actually our 33rd year of operation. Albertans have been excited about solar energy for quite a while. We're a nonprofit society that is dedicated to accelerating Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. We do so by advocating, educating, and serving as an industry and community hub for solar energy. Our membership is made up of over 750 individuals and over 160 businesses. We also have over 21,000 followers. We provide a number of services, including managing a solar directory through our website, with actually over 48,000 hits last year. In this way, we act as a bridge for installers, suppliers, and other solar-related businesses to connect with their customers and clients. You can see a screenshot of the directory here on this slide and a link to it in the chat. In addition to our website services, we run a number of educational programs, including our solar show, this solar seminar series, and a number of in-person and online networking events each year. Recordings of our previous solar show sessions and all previous seminars can be found on our Solar Alberta YouTube channel. Our next solar series session will take place on May 16th at noon, and it'll be all about helping Albertans find the right installer for their rooftop. You can register through the link in the chat for that. We're also hosting our Solar and Friends networking and trade show event in Calgary in person on May 23rd from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Energy Transition Center. You can register to attend for free through the link in the chat, and trade show booths are on at a significant discount until May 5th. This fall, we're once again running a number of online courses for solar industry professionals or those transitioning into the sector. In the meantime, recordings of our full slate of courses are available for sale alongside our paid workshops in the solar training videos section of our website. In other education-related news, we're pleased to announce the Solar Alberta Diversity Scholarship This scholarship is intended for equity-deserving individuals. Through the scholarship, we're seeking to promote inclusivity, amplify historically marginalized voices, and encourage diverse participation in the solar and solar-related sector. We will award $2,000 to one equity-deserving individual registered in an Alberta training program that aligns with our mission. And we're accepting applications until April 30th. Eligibility details and the scholarship application are available by clicking on the link in the chat. We're very thankful to Enbridge for sponsoring this scholarship. In addition to providing education about solar, we also advocate for it. We are currently rising up for renewables. We have lawn signs available for pickup in 11 municipalities around the province and for delivery in 8. We also have new template letters on our website asking the Government of Alberta to eliminate the new and discriminatory buffer zones that they have established for renewable energy. Your support with our advocacy efforts is very important, and you can click on the link in the chat to make a sign order or find our template letters today. If you're not already, I just want to encourage you to join Solar Alberta as a member. We're constantly evolving our member service offerings, some of which include discounts on our courses and workshops, access to member-only content, and more. Individual membership is just $35 and can be purchased at the link in the chat. And if you're looking to support our work in other ways, please consider volunteering or donating. The links to be a general volunteer or donate are being popped in the chat as well. Now, without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to give a shout out to Firefly Solar for sponsoring this year's seminar series as a whole, and GreenGate for sponsoring this session in particular. We couldn't offer all of this amazing free content without the support of our sponsors. We are always interested in developing more partnerships for our events. If you or your company want to work with us to educate the public about solar or solar-related technologies, please don't hesitate to reach out. And now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Farah Sheriff is a project manager in the Renewable Energy Integration Group at Natural Resources Canada CanMet Energy Research Centre in Varennes, Quebec. She leads various activities related to distributed energy resource flexibility, flexible load control strategies, variable renewable energy resources, and electrified grid active communities, smart grid, grid stability, smart grid standards, and grid modernization pathways. Prior to joining the Renewable Energy Integration Group, she was part of the development team of the RET Screen Clean Energy Management software at CanMet Energy, where she managed the RET Screen data onboarding service and was responsible for providing premium services to key users to help them with their portfolio-wide deployment of the RET Screen platform. The RET Screen software platform incorporates benchmark, feasibility, performance, and portfolio analysis and enables low-carbon planning, implementation, monitoring, and reporting. Farah obtained a Bachelor in Electrical Engineering from Université de Sherbrooke and a Master of Applied Science in Mechanical Engineering, specialization in geothermal well fields modeling from École Polytechnique de Montréal. She has been working in the renewable energy and energy efficiency fields since 1999. Welcome, Farah, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to just stop my screen share, turn the mic over to you, and I'll also turn the camera over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Heather, and thank you also, Stephanie, for holding this event and for inviting me. And thank you all for attending this webinar. Today, I'll talk about Canada's path to net zero. So I will first go over Canada's electricity system, and then I'll explain a little bit the international context using IEA and IRENA's projections. Then I'll go over the Canada net zero scenario, and I'll explain how our group, the Renewable Energy Integration Program, how do we help working towards this net zero goal. So to reach this target, the distributed energy resources will play a big role. So I'll talk about that. And finally, I'll touch on the solar photovoltaic current situation and potential. in Canada and all over the world. So let me first start and give you a little bit of context. So our group, the Renewable Energy Integration Group, is part of the CanMet Energy Research Center. There are three of the CanMet Energy Research Centers. So there is one located in Varennes, where our team is based. There is one located in Ottawa, and there is one in Devon, Alberta, where they focus on fossil fuel decarbonization. CanMet Energy is a research lab, part of Natural Resources Canada. And in Canada, we're the biggest organization doing research in clean energy. So there are hundreds of scientists, engineers, and technicians working towards that goal. So why do we need a smarter grid? So there is a growing demand in electricity in Canada that's driven by the net zero targets. So more and more electric vehicles are on the roads. There's a natural gas heating system being converted to electrical heating systems. So the grid has to evolve and to accommodate for this increased electrification while still minimizing the infrastructure investments. So to allow for high penetration of variable renewable energy, VREs, wind and solar will take up a big place. However, these technologies are not available 100% of the time. They have a low inertia compared to conventional technology. So this will require different planning and operational approaches. Wind and PV are renewable energy resources, and typical variable renewable energy will produce DC electricity. So this has to be converted into AC electricity in order to power loads or to provide electricity to the grid. So the equipment to do that is called an inverter. So these resources are often called inverter-based resources. And so they can be seen as a problem in grid modernization, but we should rather see them as being part of the solution. So they can provide grid services. The load flexibility can help the grid. Now let's look at the international context. So the International Renewable Energy Agency, the IRENA, is proposing a scenario for a 1.5 degree Earth temperature increase. So in this scenario, the projections are that we will be tripling the renewables by 2030. So this means that there will be an additional 11,000 gigawatts of renewable added on the grids. Solar and PV will account for about 90% of renewable energy additions. So in terms of investments, what does that mean? It can reach up to $1,300 billion annually by 2030 in renewable power generation. So that seems gigantic, but don't forget that this is at the international level. It's not only for Canada. And in fact, the cost of not investing is higher than the cost of taking action. The cost of not taking action is higher than the cost of taking action. So we cannot afford not to invest. They've also set some grid modernization goals. So one of them is expanding the grid. So increasing the power generation capacity to supply energy and power for the increasing demand. The second goal is to have more and more smart grid technology, so more flexible loads, enhanced control, distributed generation. And finally, integration of storage in combination of these other goals. So there is a lot to be done all over the world, not only in Canada. And on this slide, I show a graph prepared by the International Energy Agency, the IEA. It shows the annual variable renewable energy share for selected countries in 2022 and the corresponding system integration phase they are in. So to reach the net zero goals, the grid has to allow for higher penetration, renewable energy penetration level. And because of their low inertia and variable nature, some accommodation must be made and the grid must evolve and modernize. So custom solutions will have to be developed. However, it won't be just one single solution. We'll have multiple solutions, combinations of solutions, depending on the regions and the needs. So the different phases as defined by the IEA, so are the phase 1, where there's not that a high level of penetration, so that doesn't have a relevant impact on the system. Phase 2 is where there's a minor to moderate impact on the system operation. Phase 3, where we're at 15, 20, 25% of penetration level, is where the VRE determines the operation pattern of the system. Then we go to phase 4 with about 30% of penetration level, where the VRE meets almost all the demand in some specific periods. And finally, in phase 5, there is a growing amount of VRE surplus for certain days or even more. So on this graph, we see that Denmark had already reached phase 5 in 2022. How did they do that? They rely a lot on wind power generation and also on interties with other regions and countries around them. So this allows them to sell their surplus whenever they occur to their neighbors. And whenever their demand is higher than their production, they can purchase electricity from the neighbor countries. Canada is in phase 2. However, depending on the province or the region, some of them might be in phase 1 and others might be in closer to phase 3. In our team, last year, we did a literature review to look at pathways to net zero scenarios. So the scope of this study was Canada with an horizon of 2050. We looked at 17 studies that were quite recent. All of them were released after 2021 and were published mostly by Canadian institutions. The objective of this literature review was to establish the current state of research and development for the Canadian grid in the context of net zero economy target by 2050. So what are the main results from this study? The main highlight is that there is more than one pathway to achieve net zero economy. And what will have an impact on these pathways? So first, there will be a significant increase in VRE penetration combined with energy storage technologies. So the availability and cost of these technologies will affect the pathways that will be chosen. Then there will be still use of fossil fuel in 2050. This is what came out from the studies. And we will have to rely on carbon capture and carbon removal technologies to reach our net zero targets. So the availability, flexibility, and cost of these technologies, as well as other emerging technologies such as small modular reactors, will have an impact on the pathways. There will be new infrastructures and interties that will be needed to better balance VREs. And finally, policies will have a great impact on the pathways, the solution pathways. On this slide, I show examples of the 2050 scenarios that was prepared by the Canada Energy Regulators. So these scenarios were published in their report called the Energy Future 2023. So on the left side, we see a graph showing the generation in terawatt hours. And on the graph on the right, we see the generation capacity in gigawatts. So the first bar shows the grid mix in 2021. The middle bar shows the grid mix in the 2050 global net zero scenario. So this is the scenario where the whole planet works toward that net zero goal in 2050. And the bar on the right shows the 2050 Canada net zero scenario. So this is where we focus on Canada's target. So what the wind generation projection, that the projected wind generation will increase from 6% in 2021 to 30% in 2050. And solar will increase from 1% to 5%. And this is due to their low capital and operating costs. So for PV, it seems a little bit low, but we're really talking about energy. If we look at the graph on the right, we see that in terms of capacity, it's a bit more important. In fact, the projected total installed rooftop capacity will reach 8.2 gigawatts by 2050, meeting 2.5% of residential and commercial electricity demand. Hydroelectric generation will still be present and will increase to around 26%. Natural gas will also be part of the grid mix and will have to rely on carbon capture, carbon storage technologies. We'll have also to rely on new nuclear additions such as SMRs. And finally, battery storage will grow with 9 gigawatts of installed capacity projected by 2050. Other forms of storage are not built into these projections. And based on the CER projection that we're seeing here, by 2050, regions in Canada will be in phase 3 to 5 as defined by the IEA report. So what do we do in our team to meet this goal? So we perform R&D to remove or address some barriers and challenges to integrate more variable renewable energy. So in the electricity grid, in all regions of Canada, including remote and northern communities. So we're a team of about 45 people, researchers, engineers, scientists, and our scientific knowledge is aligned in providing policy and regulatory insights into questions regarding pathways to net zero. We have 5 research teams. So those are resource potential and evolution, inverters and stability, flexibility, control, protection and operation, and finally planning. So our R&D activities address these research teams in the scope of electricity and renewable energy integration into the grid. So we also address the role of renewable energy in enabling decarbonization and electrification. And these questions are looked at various levels. So if we focus on the graph in the middle, let's start at the bottom. We have research activities at the resource and device level. So for example, we have test benches on inverters at our facilities. So we test how advanced inverter function can answer some of the grid services. We also have a hot water heater test bench. So how can hot water heaters act as storage, can be used as storage or be used to displace the load during peak periods? Now let's go one level up again. How do these equipment operate together? How can we better control them? If we go another level up, if we have multiple variable loads and distributed generation and storage, how can all these equipment interact effectively and safely together in a neighborhood, community, or city? And finally, what are the impacts at the regional and national grid levels? So when we're thinking about the grid mix in 2050, we should question ourselves whether we're using all the potential available of all these loads and generation at all levels. So they're all interrelated, and the electrification has to be grid friendly. So what is a grid friendly electrification? In fact, we need all sectors to plan for the future grid together. Transmission, distribution, building, transportation. All these sectors need to communicate and collaborate together when planning for the adoption of electrification strategies. So the grid has to modernize at the same pace as the increase in electrification. Well, in fact, it has to progress at always have to be one step further, the increase in the demand on the grid. And one of the so one thing that will happen is that we'll build new infrastructure that will consider the flexibility potential of the distributed energy resources. So I'm talking about distributed energy resources now. I'll talk a little bit further about this later on, because they will be key in the energy transition in Canada. And smart grid technologies will ensure the grid remains resilient, reliable, and efficient. So here is an example of a grid-friendly integration of an electric vehicle charging. So the graph on the left, on the y-axis, we see the EV load, and on the right, on the x-axis, we see the time of the day. So the blue line shows a business as usual charging profile. So people will go to work, will go to school, and come back home around 4 or 5 p.m., plug in their car, and use the electricity from the grid until 8, 9, 10 p.m. However, this is the same period where other loads will typically occur in a household. So people will be cooking, taking showers, heating the rooms. So this will add an additional burden on the grid. So what would be a better way, a more grid-friendly integration would be to use a flexible charging as shown on using the orange line. So this is where you come back from work, but you start your charging only later on at 9, 10 p.m. and your car will charge overnight. So if we look at the graph on the right, we have the decarbonization on the y-axis and the resiliency, reliability, the grid resiliency, reliability, and efficiency on the x-axis. So the business as usual scenario that I just described will help with the decarbonization. However, it will make the grid less reliable. If we use manual scheduling, then we'll make the grid more reliable and help with decarbonization. But if we want to go a step further, we could use smart charging, use automatized control, maybe having the grid sending signals whenever there are peak periods. So this will help even more into the decarbonization and the grid reliability. And we could go even further. So we could have a V2H, vehicle to home scenario, where the vehicle battery provides electricity to the home, or a V2G, vehicle to grid scenario, where the vehicle can provide grid services to the grid. So this figure shows that uncoordinated actions to decarbonize the economy could lead to making the grid less reliable. However, if we coordinate our action, we can ensure that the grid innovation aligns with the new features to accommodate our goals. We should not miss the opportunity of doing this correctly. So I was talking about distributed energy resources. And so what are those? So they not only include power generation, they also include storage and controllable loads. And these will be key to the transition to avoid extensive and expensive additional generation. So they improve the accessibility, affordability. They are easier to deploy than building big hydro dams, for example. And as I was mentioning in the previous slide, they are located closer to the consumers, to the loads. So this makes it easier to use them more efficiently. And so DERs, they not only impact, but they can support the grid. So using their flexibility, for example, they can help by modulating or shifting their active and reactive power. They could be used to maintain the operation during fault or balance the real power flow during normal conditions or during contingencies. Now let's talk about the solar photovoltaic, the current status in Canada and all over the world. So I know that this slide has a lot of information, a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs. So let's first focus our attention on the graph at the bottom right. It shows the evolution of PV across the world. So in 2023, China has installed more solar PV than the rest of the world in a year. So as a comparison, in 2021, Canada had a total overall installed capacity of 149 gigawatts. So here I'm talking about all sources, fossil fuel, wind, PV, etc. And China installed 277 gigawatts in solar only in 2023. So that's almost a double than our entire capacity in the country. Now let's have a look at the graph at the top right. It shows the top 10 countries with the highest PV penetration. So let me bring to your attention that Australia, Germany, Japan are in the top 10 countries. I'm talking about those countries because now I'll have some comparison indication with solar radiation in Canada. So this will help us understand better. So this graph shows the PV penetration level for several countries around the world. So it's a different view of the previous graph. And we see that solar PV energy accounted for 8% of the world's electricity generation in 2023. And for Canada, it represented 1.4% of the electricity production. In total, at least 18 countries produce more than 10% of their electricity using solar PV. And some of them, in spite of having a lower solar resources than Canada, such as Germany and Japan, as we will see a bit later on. The cumulative national installed capacity, PV capacity in Canada at the end of 2022 was 4.32 gigawatt. And about 1/3 of that capacity was distributed energy. So I was talking about distributed energy resources previously. So this is electricity that is produced on site. And 2/3 is centralized, coming from utility scale PV power plants. The increase in installed PV capacity for 2022 was 469 megawatts, and this represents a growth of approximately 12% compared to the previous year. Alberta represents approximately 31% of Canada's total cumulative installed capacity in 2022. On this map, we see the solar photovoltaic potential in Canada. So in orange, we see the regions with the highest potential. And if we go up north, yellow, green, blue, we have a lower PV potential. So what we see here is that Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan have the highest PV potential. Now let's look at some numbers. So we have the PV potential for major cities in Canada. So if we look at the Regina, which is the city that has the best annual PV potential, its value, as well as the value for Calgary, is similar to the one for Sydney in Australia. And you remember this, Australia is part of the top 10 countries with the highest penetration level. And now if we look at the lowest, the city with the lowest potential, St. John's, it has a better potential than Tokyo or Berlin, which are located in countries with, in the top 10 countries with the highest penetration level. Even cities like Whitehorse, Iqaluit, or Yellowknife that are up north have a better potential, PV potential than St. John's or other cities with a lot of PV installed. So there is a vast untapped solar potential in Canada that still needs to be harvested. Lately, our team has published a report on rooftop PV technical potential. So the objective was to assess the technical photovoltaic potential of the Canadian building stock. So we used LiDAR data as well as building footprint data to represent each rooftop. And then we use this to model the shading for each rooftop segment for all hours of the year. After the PV potential for 11 municipalities was quantified in terms of the total PV capacity that could be installed on their rooftop, and the annual generation was calculated. So we used the results from these 11 representative municipalities to develop some coefficient, and we applied these coefficients using a statistical method to all the regions in the country. So we were able to calculate the technical potential up to 300, that comes up to 300 gigawatts of PV installed on building rooftops, and a generation of up to 247 terawatt hours annually. So this represents 76% of the current electricity needs in residential and commercial buildings. Because this study focused on residential, commercial, and institutional facilities. It did not include apartment buildings or industrial facilities because of a lack of data. And it's really focused on the technical potential. So this includes the energy resource available, as well as the area available on the rooftops and the system performance. So it did not include the parking canopies, utility scale PV, floating, or agri PV. Another thing is that it did not take into account whether the load coincides with the production during the year. But still, it's a great potential that we have in Canada. In fact, it's even more. We could imagine that it's even more than what we've came up to. And if we look here at the schematic on the bottom right, so we are at the technical potential level. So we did not look at either the economical potential and the market potential. Per province, we have the results per province here. So for Alberta, the PV potential is about 35 gigawatts or 32 terawatt hours. And this represents 106% of the actual building demand in Alberta. So when you look at all the provinces, you see that, for example, in Quebec, it's 43%. So the percentage is higher in Alberta because heating has not been electrified while it has been in Quebec. So the electrical load demand is higher in Quebec than in Alberta because of that. So in conclusion, there will be an increase in electrification. And as we can see in the two graphs shown on this slide, the Canadian Climate Institute estimates that the projected electricity generation requirement will increase by a factor of 1.6 to 2.1. And the projected installed generation capacity requirements will increase by 2 to 3 times. So in order to meet the net zero goal, there is an urgent need to integrate more and more distributed energy resources. We need to exploit the flexibility and to diversify the distributed generation technologies. So what are the key takeaways today? There is a huge potential in Canada in terms of PV generation, but also in terms of flexibility of loads. And if the full potential of all the distributed energy resources is exploited, this will allow to limit the grid expansion and major investments. So I'll get back to you, Heather, for the question period.
Oh, thank you very much. That was really quite the presentation. I have about 1 million questions to ask, so but I won't ask them yet because I know that others probably have questions as well. So just want to encourage folks to start using the Q&A box, enter your questions for Farah. And if you'd like to ask your question in French, she's also capable of answering in both official languages. I want to welcome Jennifer Hiscock to our Q&A session. Hi, Jen. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, just so folks know who you are and why you're chiming in here with us in our presentation, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to. So I am the Director of Electricity, Transportation, and Buildings Innovation within the Office of Energy Research and Development here at NRCan. So Farah and I are in the same department, but my office manages program funding for programs like some of the projects, for funding of some of the projects that Farah presented to you just now, but also for projects that are led by private sector, utilities, and academia in those spaces.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, and we're really glad you both could join us today. I see a couple questions starting to pop into the chat here. So I'll ask the first one, and then as I mentioned, I've got a couple myself just burning to ask. So one person is asking, what can help keep the modernization of the grid affordable to the ratepayers? I think I even heard you touching on that in your last slide there, Farah. So maybe I'll let you take off on that one.
Yes, so in order to avoid construction of big hydro dams or other big power generation infrastructure, we need to manage better our load. So use the flexibility of the loads that we have. So I was giving the example of the electric vehicles, but this can be done with many other loads. So with hot water heaters. So if we spread the demand over the day, this can help avoid building big infrastructure and defer big investments.
Yeah, that's neat to think about just how we use our appliances and when we use our appliances. And I know a lot of them are integrating smart technology these days, but here in Alberta, we don't yet have any incentives in place to encourage us to use our appliances in a smarter way. Are there places around the country where you've seen smart technologies and usage like that adopted or regulated or incentivized successfully?
Yeah, maybe I could take that one first, and then Farah, if you have other examples. So in I guess there's a category of projects, if I can be permitted just to use just a little bit of jargon here, they like to call them non-wires alternatives for being able to get more out of the existing infrastructure that we have. So an example of that would be, we're having problems with the quality of power at the end of this long feeder line that's running through a rural area. We'll have to do an upgrade of the whole system so that we can pass more power through there and make sure that they don't have any of these kind of light flickering problems or other problems with the power quality at the end of the line. Now, you can imagine how expensive that is. Typically, your distribution facility operator, you call them DFOs in Alberta, they call them local distribution companies in Ontario. Typically, they're only allowed to propose a solution to a problem like that by upgrading the system or building out more of the system. But in a recent case, Hydro One was able to approach the regulator and say, you know what, we've run the numbers. It's actually going to be cheaper for us to improve power quality for, and there were only a few of these residents, a few dozen on the line. They said, if we put battery power systems in the next to the buildings with all of these customers, it will improve their power quality, also improve reliability if there's a tree that falls on the line somewhere up the stream. And putting these battery systems out there for all these customers is actually cheaper than upgrading all of the wires and infrastructure all the way down to the end of the line. So that's an example where we're starting to rethink the rules that there were around what sorts of solutions utilities are even allowed to propose for improving for grid modernization and making sure that having a better power service for all of the customers' needs are maintained.
Yeah, that distributed storage piece is something we've been hearing about, and I know a lot of our members have started doing a lot of training in that. We do offer a course on that, which is one of our most popular courses. But of course, the challenge is twofold. In Alberta, of course, the incentives aren't really there yet to adopt any distributed storage. And then I've also heard that there are some issues with various rules and regulations around storage. For example, you have to have it in like a separate building, you can't like have it necessarily in your home. And so lots of challenges to overcome there as well, regulatory challenges. I see a question on storage in the chat, so I'm going to ask that here, and maybe you can touch on a couple of those issues as we go along. What are current barriers to the installation of energy storage? And I'm gonna add there both long duration, large scale energy storage and distributed storage, because we're hearing different stories about that long duration storage in Alberta. Some people say it's a myth and it doesn't exist. Other people say it's actually already happening. And so this is very confusing for those of us who are trying to make sure that storage is coming alongside solar. This person who's attending is asking, it seems that Alberta mainly does solar installations without storage. So they're chatting mostly on the distributed side and solar in the communities, storage as well. So thoughts on that those barriers pieces, and I guess both small and large.
Yes, so thank you for your question. So the main barrier to installation of energy storage is the cost at this stage. There is a lot of research being done at the federal government, not necessarily at NRCan, but in other departments on batteries. So this will most likely help reduce the cost over time. And what we encourage is a combination of multiple technologies. So I was talking about distributed energy resources. So having not only storage, but also the flexibility of the loads, controllable loads, and PV generation. So it's a combination of multiple things that will help reduce the overall cost.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
the distributed storage and the long duration storage are two different equations because they serve different use cases or different needs. And so it's interesting to see how much the business case for either of those, long duration storage or distributed storage, has to do with local costs of electricity, and what sort of value that customers can access from those technologies. In the case of a long duration storage facility, that's going to be a grid asset. That's going to be owned by somebody who's selling into a power pool or owned by a utility, depending where you are. And so those equations are determined by, is it cheaper for me to have something like a natural gas generator with CCUS, or is it cheaper for me to build long duration storage, or is it cheaper for me to just overbuild wind and solar so that I know that I have enough in the periods that I need it? So it's a question of kind of optimizing all of your different supply and demand sources, as Farah points out. Like, we're not just looking at it from a supply side of the equation anymore. But there are a lot of higher level provincial factors that come into play when you're figuring out long duration storage. Certainly we have technologies that can do it, and we've seen them working elsewhere in the world. And then the distributed storage seems to have a lot to do with, yes, the cost per kilowatt hour, but also what are the different revenue streams that are available to you once you install the storage. And it is a complicated regulatory space when you look across the country. It's at least 13 different regulatory regimes kind of dictating what you're allowed to get money for from your battery. And so I think that makes it complicated and just more costly because of that.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll start to see our way through some of these complexities over the years to come. Another question here in the chat: do you see the regulations or regulatory bodies as a limiting factor to the adoption or pace of the modernization that can occur? I mean, there's so many different regulating bodies across the country. That must be a very challenging question to ask. Some are probably a little bit more out front of others, I imagine. But want to take a stab at that? Are there any limitations there in terms of that oversight? Or on the flip side, maybe what's easier to answer, Are there any best practices that you wanted to mention in terms of the regulatory bodies and folks who are kind of ahead of the curve? Because I know as bureaucrats, probably not supposed to comment on all the the folks who are being naughty.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly we don't cast judgment, but we do try to better understand. So I would say generally to that question, the answer is yes, but I would also say probably fewer than you think. So in some cases, when people throw up the excuse of regulatory barriers, they're talking about any number of typically 4 different things. One could be just that it's hard to make the business case about the value to customers. And so because it's hard to quantify the exact value to customers, it's hard to prove it in a rate filing. That's not necessarily that the regulation's not letting you do it. It's just that we don't have good data, good numbers, or the utility often is the one promoting it, is having a hard time presenting the evidence properly. So that's more on the capacity of the person putting the case forward. Another aspect could be just the cost effectiveness tests that are typically used for determining whether or not we should invest in one type of an asset or another often has a lot of things, you know, in economic terms that we might call the externalities that just don't factor into your equation. But increasingly, those externalities are getting real value. So those externalities could be things like looking at the social cost of not shifting away from fossil fuels, for example, and having air quality impacts that affect local health or regional health. So those factors are often considered externalities, but we're getting better data on understanding the overall system cost for not moving to one thing or another. So just the cost effectiveness tests themselves that are used to bring the evidence forward could be what they're talking about. In some cases, they're just talking about problems in the actual legislation that's there, and the regulator is like, I mean, it's only my job to implement, but I don't write the laws. You know, that's not actually me. So you're talking about a policy issue, or the policy framework does give you lots of room to do this, but it's not being interpreted that way, and so we have to change the interpretation. So that's like 4 different things that I just listed to you that some people will call regulatory barriers, which have to do with different actors and their role in the system. So a lot of times people think, oh, the rules are wrong, they're too restrictive. And many times they're not actually wrong. There's lots of room in here, but it's one of these other actors that just hasn't seen this enough before, doesn't know yet how to work with these new technologies in this space.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'd add a fifth actually in Alberta, which is also that municipal component, because there's another land use sort of discussion here, and the municipalities have considerable veto power over land use as well now. And so it is interesting as well to think of maybe your issues are regulatory, but at what level of government too, and what order of government. So it's definitely a lot to factor in when you think about regulation and the regulators. Farah, did you have something to add there?
Yes, well, the energy is a provincial jurisdiction, so there are challenges in coordinating with every province. So really, everyone should, at every level, should work together, and this will be key to. So you were talking about best practices, so that would be the main one, to work together.
Yeah, to coordinate and draw on each other's knowledge. I recently met a woman who was installing solar in a municipality where they had never had anyone do so before in Alberta. And so they were making her jump through a lot of hoops that other municipalities would not. And I thought, oh, it's too bad they're not chatting. It's too bad they're not talking, because if they did talk to the municipality one over, they could probably save themselves and her a lot of time and energy, and not have to reinvent the wheel over and over and over, right? I
Yeah.
see a lot of questions popping in here, so I feel like I should move on, but I see, Jen, that you had something to add there, so go ahead.
Yeah, I've read some studies where they're talking about this in the US, and certainly I cannot put this all on the feet of the developers and the installers of solar storage projects. But I would say that overall, they felt like the renewable energy industry was just a little less mature in terms of that kind of level of community engagement and education, and saying, did you know this community over here just did this? Compared to other industry sectors like the natural gas sector, which knows how to come into a new community, find out, what's important to you, what's going on, invest in some playgrounds or whatever, like they really build that trust and that feeling like they're part of a community. And then it just makes the decision making so much easier when the local customers feel like their needs, their problems are understood. And I think sometimes we, kind of trip over ourselves when we think, oh, we're on the right side of this climate challenge problem, so people should just automatically open the door and let us in.
Yes.
Turns out they don't. You still have to listen. You still have to find out what matters locally, and you still have to be able to build that kind of community trust, even if, what you're selling is good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of work to do on the community trust and conversation piece, no matter what energy industry you're in, hey? Chris is asking here, how can we improve interconnection between different provincial bodies? Is there a plan to create a larger interprovincial agency? Now, I am wondering how you interpret that. I was thinking we're talking about interconnections of transmission lines, but then when Chris said different provincial bodies, I'm wondering if he's talking about maybe the connections between governments. So do you have an interpretation of that question that Chris is asking? Do you hear that as about transmission interties, or do you hear that about coordination between governments? Either way, very on topic. So maybe we should talk about both.
Yes.
And I actually had a very similar question, which really was, who's going to take the lead on building out those regional interties? Who is coordinating that? Do you see the federal government playing a role in bringing various regional governments together? I have to admit, we've just been through a federal budget. We're talking a lot about the electricity system here in Alberta, and I haven't heard either order of government talk about regional interties, building out transmissions, making them smarter, investing in that kind of system. So it is a bit disconcerting to me to not hear any governments talking about it. Do you think there are folks taking the lead on those connections and building out our, as you mentioned, I think, Farah, you said in Europe, they're actively drawing on each other's systems. And yet here, I think we only have 3 interconnection points in all of Alberta with other jurisdictions.
So in Europe, they have the ENSO, which is the European Network of Transmission System Operators, which represent 40 electricity transmission system operators in 36 countries. So they have this system in place. And in Canada, we have the Electricity Advisory Council that was created, and it acts as an independent electricity sector focused body that can provide advice to the Minister of Natural Resources Canada on how to accelerate investments and promote the growth of sustainable, affordable, and reliable electricity systems. So there are some action going on there. Of course, there could be more. Maybe, Jen, you have more to say about that.
Yeah, exactly. So the advisory council that Farah just mentioned has a 1-year mandate. So we're expecting their recommendations and their final report to be released next month. I know one of the working groups was looking at regional coordination. So it is definitely topical. People are starting to ask those sorts of questions where, 5-10 years ago, we wouldn't dare. We've built out these systems in Canada quite provincially, as you note, with stronger ties to the US in terms of north-south trade than we have with east-west. But there is definitely benefits to be gained from east-west, but it's going to be absolutely driven by the provinces and territories that are involved in those conversations and stand to benefit from it. And the role of the federal government is generally just to make those decisions easier to make. So you can see different programs that were established by the government in Budget 23, which was looking at transmission feasibility studies, just the scoping work, the preparation work, so that all the interested stakeholders could understand the costs and the implications, but also the value that they could stand to gain. It becomes a complicated equation when you have some of these networks crossing multiple provincial borders, and you're trying to figure out which province should pay how much for this kind of interconnection. But you're right, it's starting to also ask the question about, okay, if we start to plan and operate our infrastructure much more regionally instead of just in the province, you know, would we need a different sort of entity that has that view as well, as opposed to just remaining in our very much isolated provincial and territorial jurisdictions? I think all the questions are allowed to be asked, and so we're seeing people start to ask them. But there's not direction from the federal government going in that way. It's just about evidence producing, making sure they have the modeling capabilities and tools if they find that there are gaps in what the industry is providing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I do find it disconcerting that our ISO projections don't involve or incorporate any vision of interties, at least in the projections I saw, or enhanced connection to other jurisdictions. So it's good to know that there are some bodies thinking about that. I'll definitely have to follow their work, and hopefully we can get some things moving and shaking here in Alberta too. Do any provinces use variable time of day pricing to influence power consumption behavior? This person is I think of surge or demand pricing tactics used in other industries, and it appears a highly effective way to balance demand, or at least make consumers pay at a higher rate during peak periods. We touched on that earlier, but yeah, have you seen any that are doing that effectively in Canada, or maybe even in the US?
Yes, well, there is already the time of use that is in place in Ontario, for example, where the tariff is higher during some peak period of the day. We also have this in Quebec, where we have some incentive. They even do it like a game. So in our team, we have the chat, everyone participates in that, and in those challenges, and we have a contest of who has saved the most energy or money during the winter. So there are programs that already exist in different provinces. But in the future, this might not be the right solution. In fact, we will need to adapt to the real need. So the peak period in the future might not be always the same every day. It might not be the same as it is today. And we need to consider also, I was giving the example of the electric vehicles. So the loads can provide grid services. So this will also affect well, we hope the pricing in order to not only reduce the demand on the grid, but also provide services, making the grid more stable, more reliable, and resilient.
Yeah. And I know that we do have some distributors here in Alberta who have been piloting a number of different programs, especially with respect to electric vehicle charging. So there's definitely some leadership there. I realized that I was chatting with them about this, though. I said, you know, the incentives would look different if someone has solar on their roof and they're actually charging their own vehicle as opposed to pulling from the grid. And it was interesting because they were piloting this program and they hadn't really thought of that. And I was like, well, you know, because we very intentionally charge when the sun is shining at our home, even if that's peak hour, because we're pulling from our own electricity. So it is interesting to think of how nuanced this is, and really how smart those programs have to be, because you're going to want to create totally different incentives depending on, like you said, totally different scenarios, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see when we're talking about using these devices that are connected to the grid for distributed energy resources, as Farah was describing, how we communicate with those devices, how we give them the signals of, can I get a little bit more power from you right now? Can I get less demand from you right now? Do you think, based on the home's thermostat right now, do you think we could preheat actually a little bit and let it ride out through the rest of the day because you're not expecting the occupants home until this time? You know, like that kind of communication. If you want to do it with prices, then you're talking about some kind of dynamic pricing scheme like Farah was talking about, which right now you really only see for the large commercial and industrial customers.
Mm-hmm.
Residential customers, largely it's just this prefixed peak happens from 7 in the morning until 9 a.m. and then you go to mid peak and then you're back to peak again from 5 to 7, which is clearly not reflecting the dynamics of the grid from any day to day, depending on if it's cloudy, depending on if it's a heat wave,
Yeah.
So if we want to use prices to do demand side optimization, then I think you're going to have to see something more like dynamic pricing. But I think to Farah's point, making a really complicated layer of pricing mechanisms might not actually be as enabling as customers need. And so that's why there's a bit of hesitation, and it's not just about a full wholesale adoption one way or the other. A lot of people like this kind of idea of set and forget for customers. So maybe there is something about, as long as I'm allowed to use your device within these parameters, I guarantee this will be your rate. And then I don't have to worry about how many cents I should compensate you here or
Yeah.
there, because that level of verification and validation would cost so much money with revenue grade meters. Like the juice isn't worth the squeeze at some point.
Juice isn't. Well, and
And
the other thing, you must have a lot of psychologists working on your teams because they're probably also trying to think out about what would the majority of people do. And I've thought about this a lot because, of course, we have solar specific pricing here in Alberta. And the first batch of people in Alberta who adopted solar, super big nerds, love thinking about, when is it time to change? Are we going to change our price? And they participate in our group. We have a chat on Facebook, and when are we going to change? Okay, for me, I'm going to change now my price, and they love that. But there's new adopters who are like, quote, normal, and they don't want the pressure. They don't want to have to log into Facebook to check if everybody else is switching every fall and spring. They are looking for people who will just set the price for them and optimize it for them. And they just want someone to make sure they're getting the optimal price. And that, I would say, might actually be the majority of the population. So it's going to be interesting to see, do you set up your systems to cater to kind of the nerdy few who really do want control over that? Or do you set it up for people who would rather just hand it to you and tell them, like, please optimize it? Do you let the businesses optimize it, as we would probably do in Alberta? Because the businesses will probably be like, hey, let me fill that void. I will optimize for you. Or in other provinces where people, are not as business oriented, do you do it as a government and as a regulatory body? So I don't know how you balance all that psychology and even just like judging which is going to appeal in which jurisdictions. I don't envy you that, but it did make me wonder if you must work with a lot of psychologists. Is that something you're always having to think about as you're planning and strategizing?
Yeah, we tend to, so we do have a behavioral scientist on our team, and she's leading our innovation and electricity regulation initiative. We have a lot of them within NRCan's Office of Energy Efficiency, because they tend to be at the customer, home, or vehicle owner sort of level. But yes, you're right, it's factoring more and more. And I would say, encouragingly, I am finding that the people that I meet working at electricity utilities aren't all power systems engineers anymore. Encouragingly, they're starting to realize that they need a much different sort of talent set and disciplinary training to be able to figure out these new sort of customer models and ways of operating the business so that it's far more relevant to these emerging customer needs.
Yeah, well, and it's not just those regulatory bodies, I think, that are diversifying. The other day, I talked to a social worker at Pembina, and I thought, I bet you she's the first social worker that Pembina's ever hired. And, again, it was about EV adoption she was working on, and she was also working on, how to get more women into these spaces, right? So it was really interesting to see that the nonprofit sector is diversifying, and also the regulators are, and we're trying to work together here. And so too at Solar Alberta, because really, I don't think there's going to be a transition if we leave half the population out. So we really do have to think about how to bring everyone along together, and that probably means diversifying our contingents of staff and everything. So thank you for that. Another question here, other than the rooftop PV technical report that was discussed in the presentation, which was very helpful, thank you, are there any resources you recommend to learn even more? So if people want to nerd out, we do have an awesomely nerdy audience. So I do appreciate that. That's part of why I wanted to work here. What would you recommend they have for their light bedtime reading?
Yes, so the International Energy Agency, PVPS, have many tasks on different topics related to PV. So you could visit their website and get a lot of information. There's industry associations like CanRIA or Solar Alberta. I don't know if you heard about them. So they have a lot, there's a lot of training and information available. Also, at Natural Resources Canada, there's the Red Screen tool that is developed. So there's a lot of training material, especially on economics as well, that is available. They have a YouTube channel. There's utilities that have also many tools available, and yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I think even the AUC put out some videos recently. I seem to recall I logged in and watched all their videos on Alberta's electrical system and how it worked. So you're right. I think people are increasingly adding more and more resources, hopefully, to get us more on the same page. I do have some high level questions, especially about the graphs that you were showing, and I hope you'll humor me as I ask you a couple questions on those graphs. I saw in one, it suggested that solar on buildings could supply 40% of our grid needs. But then in the other scenario, a net zero by 2050 only called for 2.5% solar PV on buildings, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm confused as to why our projections are so low for rooftop solar by 2050 if theoretically we could do 40% of the supply with rooftop solar.
Okay.
I was wondering if I maybe misunderstood those different graphs because I was looking at, okay, rooftop solar is going to contribute 2.5, and I know CanRIA says we're going to contribute 4% to the net zero grid. But then I saw your 40%, and since so many of our members are rooftop solar people, I just had to ask, what role are we going to play here? Are we going to give 40% eventually somehow, or are we aiming to be a smaller, bit part in this system? I'm
Yes.
curious.
So the 40% comes out of our study that we did on the technical PV potential. So the technical PV potential takes into account the solar resource, the area available on rooftops, and the performance of the systems. It does not take into account the market adoption, any economical criterias. So it's really only the technical potential that is taken into account.
I see. So there's a big
also,
difference there between what we could do and what we are expected to do or projected to do.
yes, and also in that study, it's not taken into account whether the load coincides with the production. So it answers the questions. If we install PV everywhere, it's technically feasible. So it's the start. But then we need to look at all the other aspects, the regulatory limits we were talking about previously, right. Policy, impact, etc.
Well, I kind of like that. I think it poses a challenge to our members because it says to me, well, you could be a big player. And now let's go out and make it happen because nobody's expecting it. So I'm really hoping we can kind of surpass those expectations because, theoretically, the closer we get to what's actually possible, the more money we can save the system as a whole in terms of the rest of the build out that's expected. And if people are genuinely concerned about our expected reliance on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as I know a number of our members are, and if they want to, try and limit that portion of the graph down the road, then they'll be extra motivated to know that they could theoretically contribute a lot more as long as we get all of our ducks in a row. So I think we'll take that as a nice challenge. See if we can't get beyond the 2.5, and maybe in the next estimate, will blow everyone's minds and be closer to the 40. That'll
Yeah.
be my dream. Our new mission for Solar Alberta, get us to 40% Canada-wide.
Look what's possible. Yeah, I would say like these energy futures reports, it's large national energy and economy models, right?
Mhm.
So it spits out what you put into the parameters. We were delighted with this one that they did because they finally said what would it take to get to 2050. So that it's really helpful, and I'm not degrading at all the work that they've done here, but I would say, you know, the way these economic models work is if every actor in this system is a rational economic decision maker that has access to information about the overall system costs of every option available, and then they will clearly choose this. And rooftop solar has a higher overall installed cost than others. But there's lots of reasons why larger power projects might not actually go through the way we thought they would, or the model thought it would. So I would say there's lots of room for movement around those edges. And you know, commercial buildings are making decisions about putting solar everywhere, not based on this wide economic model that they've done, but because they want to bring down their scope 1 emissions, and they want to be seen as like a clean employer. There's lots of reasons that we could see people making these decisions that aren't totally factored around the total, like the least cost of energy from a like provincial system perspective.
I see. So they're really looking at, the here and now, and then the economic component. Yeah. Whereas I really do see that there are a lot of unknowns that are coming into play. First of all, I would suspect that those projections don't even factor in some of the global instability that we have right now, which is contributing to very different decisions, I think, than we would have had just 2 years ago. It seems like in Europe and elsewhere, people are thinking more about energy independence than ever before. And I know that's a big thread here in Alberta, is how can we be more energy independent, which could really change those economics quite quickly. We might see a shift towards more solar on rooftops than anyone would ever expect, just as people try to strive to be less dependent on other nations that might be more politically volatile and other
Yeah,
regions.
well, that or even just supply chains generally are affecting things way more than we thought they would. It is really hard these days to buy a transformer, and even to get all the cabling for wires. And so some of that might impact it. We're also seeing it's difficult through the new trade regulations to get solar panels into the country, depending on where they were made and if they were able to comply with the regulations against forced labor. So, I think a lot of these things are sort of temporary blips as people start to orient themselves around what's required for compliance. But you're right, supply chain factors can really come into play there in a way that, isn't always modeled well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just something we pick up a lot on here because we get people calling in and they're first of all worried about prices going up in the future for electricity. So they're thinking, how do I make hay while the sun shines, right? They're thinking, how do I invest now to save myself money later? And that's not always factored in. I think if people if there's that fear factor, are you nervous about what the future holds? And as we've seen with the inflation nationwide, sometimes that fear factor and people's expectations has a stronger impact than any other economic factor on a system. So managing expectations is really important. So
and just to complete on that, hosting capacity could also be a reason for the technical potential to be reduced. So in our team, we're working on that. We have research activities on increasing the hosting capacity. But for example, in South Australia, they have a lot of integration of solar. And what they use is smart inverters that can access to a variable export limit between 1.5 to 10 kilowatts per phase. And this automatically adjusts the export capacity to the local network throughout the day. So this makes it more dynamic, and they're able to put on more PV and accept only what they need depending on what the grid can accept.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it makes me think as well about how I have heard that solar is a lot cheaper in Australia than it is in the US. You were mentioning, Jen, that the rules around sourcing and supply chain that we have around not using forced labor for solar, which of course, you know, is something I think most people would support. But I'm wondering, are we seeing the same kind of cost differences impacting the growth of solar in Canada that, you know, where we're paying a lot more than a country like Australia, for example? Is that happening here as well?
Oh, I haven't done a supply chain comparison between Australia and Canada for PV. I don't know if the PVPS group, Farah or Irina, might be looking at these things that you're aware of, but yeah, it would be a good assessment to see, like, is Canada more vulnerable to some of these supply chain implications or disruptions in other regions? Is that what you're?
Well, it's more around the costs, you know, because I never know when I hear news from the US and folks will say, oh, you know, solar costs way more in the US than in Australia. I don't never know, are we more like the US or more like Australia? You know, usually I think we're more like the US, but I never like to. The downside is nobody ever draws those comparisons about Canada, right? Because they're always looking at the US. So it's something we can explore down the road because I am curious about our own tariffs and regulations and whether those are increasing costs here. I had also heard that costs were a bit higher here than maybe in Europe, and maybe similarly so it could be related to that. We've got another
Yeah,
great.
I would
Oh, yeah.
say we'll try and give you a link if we can in a follow-up to these PVPS, the photovoltaic power systems program under the IEA. They do an annual survey of installed costs. So not just like
Oh,
unit module, but like what does it cost to install it? And then
nice.
you can, all the member countries do this annual survey, and then you can see it over
Mm.
the years. So there should be something good to send you on that.
Yeah,
So,
thank
but
you. That's good to know.
just a note that solar panel prices are decreasing everywhere. So they've decreased by 6 times in Canada since 2008. So this should be noted. And another thing is that our base electricity here is cheaper than in Australia. So in comparison, maybe the PV is cheaper than the conventional electricity generation than it is here.
They have more incentive there because of that high cost. Yeah, and it does occur to me too that even across Canada, those incentives can be quite different. I know we've been hearing a lot about heat pumps lately in the east, and of course there are a couple being deployed here, but they're not being adopted as readily here. And it occurs to me that the cost of natural gas heating here must be a factor, must be quite low compared to what people are paying for heat in eastern parts of the country. So it's must be challenging trying to think about such a diverse landscape as our country. We've got another question here. Could you elaborate on hosting capacity, please? Farah, I think you were touching on hosting capacity. Maybe a little bit more about what that is and what you were chatting about there.
Yes, well, the hosting capacity is the capacity of the grid of accepting more renewable energy. So I was talking about the penetration level. So there are limitations on the grid so on the transmission grid to allow for a higher penetration level. So there are some sections that are more congestion. So we're looking at solution to reduce these congestions in different regions. If we think about also at the distribution level, if everyone installs PV in a certain neighborhood, can the grid accept all this quantity of PV or wind or other generation? So this is the hosting capacity.
Yeah, and that's something that's come up more and more in the last year. I don't remember when I started at Solar Alberta, we weren't chatting too much about that 3.5 years ago, but with so many different projects trying to build out, we're starting to hear about that, not at the residential level so much, more at the solar farm and 2 megawatt and up level. So I have heard about a couple projects around the country, around the province, where they said, we can't accept what you have to offer in this part of the grid. And so what they were saying is we can't host your community generation project here, you're going to have to build elsewhere. I was told that in Texas, they're building out transmission capacity and also the hosting capacity to places. And then they're saying to developers, okay, we're building out here, you can build over here, and giving a little bit more direction to folks so that they're not just kind of guessing and then finding out after they've already made some land agreements that their land is not going to work for the hosting capacity. Have you seen any jurisdictions around Canada do that, where they kind of build and then direct folks where they have hosting capacity if they're wanting to put on a couple megawatts or more?
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, NMAX is quite active into that field. They have built a hosting capacity map already, and we're developing guidelines in our group in order to guide people on how to add more PV and other renewable energy technologies. And it has to be coordinated with the other solutions that I spoke about during the presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think a lot of us who are micro generators, we often think, oh, we're just so helpful. All we're doing is, reducing the pressure on the grid. It doesn't really occur to us sometimes that actually we're increasing the pressure for folks to receive what we have to offer. And so we're only really thinking about how we're not consuming as much from the grid. We're not really thinking about how not everybody wants the gift we have to offer. So it's definitely a mental shift for a lot of us micro generators. I think the utility scale are quite comfortable and familiar with that, and power plants have always had to learn about that concept, but it's something a little bit newer to us who are on the smaller side. Oh, and Gordon, thank you, Gordon. Fortis has had a hosting capacity map for several years. Thank you, Gordon. So it sounds like a number of our wire providers are moving and shaking on that front. So I'll have to go find those resources, and maybe we'll push them out in a blog sometime. I know, Farah, you mentioned folks could look to us for resources, and I have to admit we have a couple, but mostly what we try and do is take really dense and complicated things and try and turn them into small blogs. So that's our resources, more the everyday folks summary of complicated material. So definitely everybody's got their niche to play. But I actually sent the report that you referenced off to some volunteers recently and said, could you make this easier to read in a blog, please? So we've got a nice team of volunteers who help us make things a little digestible. So thanks, Gordon, for that. And just some final comments here. Farah, I think maybe before we wrap up, anything you wanted to end off on or mention?
Well, I just wanted to complete regarding the hosting capacity question. So the inverters I was talking about to convert the DC energy into AC energy. So they are key into increasing the hosting capacity. So there are advanced inverter functions that are being developed, and that will allow the inverter to support the grid in a more friendly manner. So we call them grid forming inverters, where they can actually form the grid instead of just following the grid. So this will really help in terms of hosting capacity in Canada.
Okay, that's good to know. Grid forming inverters.
We just had a symposium where we brought utilities together from across the country, and those who were involved in our first round of the Smart Grid program. And we actually had Farah's director asked the audience, how many of you utilities are starting to experiment with grid forming inverters and smart inverters and see what you can get from the system? And you would be happy to know that NMAX was one of only a small handful who raised their hands. So you do have those that are experimenting there in Alberta.
Well, that's actually what I was saying to someone the other day. They were choked. They were people call in to complain a lot, and they were saying, oh, I only have one wire provider in my area. Why can't I choose my wire provider? Albertans never tire of choice. anyways, and I said, well, did you know that in other jurisdictions, they don't even have this many? Like, we actually have more than every other province. And ours actually tend to push the envelope a lot because there are so many wire providers. I'm like, yes, you can't choose depending, I mean, you can choose where to live in the province, and then you can have a different wire provider. But I don't think they even knew what they were asking for. I was like, dude, you really want competing wires coming in and out of the neighborhood? Like that might really ruin your view. I didn't really explain that to them, but I'm like, I don't know if you want that level of competition here. I see ATCO has a hosting capacity map that folks are kindly putting in the chat as well. I strongly suspect if NMAX has it, EPCOR has it, because they're always neck and neck and like to one up each other in a very friendly competition way. So nice to see that those exist and that folks can make smart and informed choices about where they're building out. And hopefully that reduces some of the tension for, of course, the folks who are developing solar and whatnot. So I just want to wrap things up here. This has been really insightful. You've got me thinking we're going to have a whole workshop on inverters, because I feel like everybody's asking me about inverters these days. I get asked about clipping and what is good clipping, what is bad clipping, and what's going on here. And there's just so many inverter questions. So yours are, of course, at a whole other level than what I hear about, but I still feel like we're going to have to go to town on inverters someday here. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jen, Farah. This has been really educational. I really appreciate it. Breath of fresh air. I always like to say, I don't really like to get bogged down on what date we get to net zero. I just want to get to net zero. So I was really glad you were willing to have this conversation with us, because let's get past the dates and the timelines, and we don't need to fight about that. Let's just say we're all working towards the same goal. How are we going to get there? And hey, the sooner the better, actually. So maybe we'll get there 10 years ahead of anyone's schedule, and that would be a dream. So thank you for joining us today. I'll give a big thanks to our sponsors again, Firefly Solar and Greengate. And just one quick poll for the audience. Want to just get your initial impression about how informative you found today's session. Always nice to get a read on whether our topics are juicy enough for our attendees. And I know we've got a lot of industry experts in the audience today, so hard to balance between the industry experts and the general public. But yeah, it looks like the vast majority found this very informative. So I appreciate that. So thanks again to our speakers today. Wonderful to learn from you and to grow together, and wish for the best for our electricity future together. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.